Herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Carolin Emcke.
A warm welcome to you. My name is Carolin Emcke, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's updated Streitraum on the topic of violence and trauma, vadis, Middle East. I've been moderating and curating this series of conversations for 20 years now. And I was really looking forward to this season, as always with the Streitraum. An overarching theme was to run through an entire theater year. As always, from October to June, we wanted to hold individual conversations on this theme or question once a month. The general theme for the season of 2023-24, which we had already decided on in summer, is in reference to Hannah Arendt, Power, Violence, Resistance. Originally, we wanted to start with a philosophical definition of the terms today and had invited Franziska Martensen, a professor of political theory. But then 7th October happened and everything no longer made sense. We couldn't and didn't want to continue with the plan as if nothing had happened, as if there had been a Hamas massacre unparalleled in its ruthlessness, in which 1,300 Israelis fell victim, as if there hadn't been 229 displaced persons for whom their relatives still fear, and as if there hadn't been a blockade and bombardment of the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of the attack, which has burdened, troubled, frightened, and made us all despair ever since. In these 20 years, I've never stepped in front of the table as I did today. I always took it for granted that I would go to the podium with my guests and moderate a conversation. Today, I can't do this. Today, I have to tell you honestly beforehand that I find this role of the distanced, most eloquent figure on stage difficult, and I am particularly ill-suited for such a task for various reasons. I was shaken to the core by the Hamas and Islamic Jihad massacres on October 7th. The horror has not yet disappeared. I realize that I'm always trying to think back to the time before 6 October, but I cannot. The days since then I search for the right terms, for some railing that will keep us stable, and only a deep, slow sadness spreads. I am never enough. I don't react fast enough. I don't think fast enough. Sometimes not one way, sometimes not the other. It's like the comforter that's too short. You pull and pluck, and something is always not covered, and you freeze. What many may not know, I know about terror. Many years ago, I lost my godfather to the terror of the Red Army faction. You never recover from that, never. And any trivialization or contextualization of terrorist violence disgusts me. I'm also particularly ill-suited for the task today for another reason. There is hardly a region I have traveled more as a reporter than the Middle East. I know the West Bank. I know Gaza from countless trips. I have Jewish, Israeli friends. I have Palestinian friends in Tel Aviv, in East and West Jerusalem, in Ramallah, in Jenin, and in Rafah. I also fear for those who have been familiar to me for many, many years, who live in Gaza, where the humanitarian situation is desperate, who have no water, no electricity, no food. The days when there is no contact possible, when I don't know who is alive and who is not, that's almost unbearable. And yet, I am about to go to this table and join my guests and have a conversation, and I promise you, I will try to conduct this as appropriately and gently as possible. All I ask is that you cut me some slack if something fails, if something is missing, if something gets snagged, if I'm too slow to respond. I am a philosopher, and I believe in understanding. But as a philosopher and as a Protestant, I know this is work. For this, we invited a panel with different perspectives, different spaces of experience, and different disciplines. There is no ban on analysis, as people have claimed in the last few days. That is important to me. This is also going to be on our agenda today. I hope that we will engage with each other and listen to each other. There will be controversy. There will be dissent. I also suspect that we will all hear something with which we disagree, perhaps also something that seems to us an imposition or an affront. But I hope that at the end of this conversation, we will have learned from each other, that perhaps other commonalities will have become visible than we thought, and that at least the differences will have taken on sharper contours. There is, and this is my deep conviction, no shortcut for talking about this conflict. We have to try to accept the pain, the anger, the sadness, and get back into conversation with each other. We are grateful, and I am grateful to my guests for engaging in this today. We here in the theater and I on stage are responsible for ensuring that our guests and also the audience feel comfortable and can speak without fear. That's why we have special security protection here today in the auditorium and in front of the theater, and I would like to express my thanks. Anton, Verat, Adil, Jerome, Ismail, and the second Ismail, Madi, Manrico, and 3 colleagues of the police, Thomas, Markus, and Daniel. Thank you very much for your support. And that's why we are foregoing the usual audience discussion today. And this is also why we have switched off the chat function in the live stream, because we can't moderate it. I ask for your understanding. I thank you for your coming, for your interest, and for your participation, and for wanting to listen. And now I would like to invite my guests to the stage. Let me introduce Omri Boehm, born in Haifa in 1979. He is an associate professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department at the New School for Social Research in New York. He is an Israeli and German citizen and has conducted research in Munich and Berlin. His book, Kant's Critique of Spinoza, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He writes about Israel, politics, culture, and philosophy in Haaretz, Die Zeit, and the New York Times, among others. His critically acclaimed books, Israel, a Utopia, and Radical Universalism, were published by Propylene. A warm welcome to you, Omri. Emilia Roig, born in Dordogne in 1983. She holds a PhD in political science, teaches, researches, and publishes on intersectionality, and is the author of the widely discussed books Why We Matter and The End of Marriage. She teaches post-colonial studies at the Goethe School Berlin, among others, and was named the Impact of Diversity Awards Most Influential Woman of the Year in 2022. She's the founder of the Berlin-based Center for Intersectional Justice. A very warm welcome, Emilia Roig. Nazih Musharbash, born in Amman in 1946, he is the president of the German-Palestinian Society. He grew up in Bethlehem, Palestine, where he graduated from Beit Jalal Evangelical Lutheran School. In 1965, he began studying education in Oldenburg, and he worked as a teacher of chemistry and biology, and later as a secondary school principal. He has been active for over 30 years as a council member and district council representative, and he was a member of the Lower Saxony State Parliament. After founding the Osnabrück Regional Group, he joined the DPG, the German-Palestinian Society, with 30 members. Musharbash also lectures on the Middle East conflict and regularly leads trips to the region. A very warm welcome to you, Nazih Musharbash. And Nicole Deitelhoff, born in Eutin in 1974. She's a professor of international relations and theories of the global orders at Goethe University Frankfurt and the director of the Leibniz-Institut for Peace and Conflict Research. She's also a co-spokesperson of the Research for Social Cohesion and co-spokesperson of the research initiative Contrast, Trust in Conflict, Political Coexistence under Conditions of Uncertainty. In 2022, she chaired the expert commission investigating the allegations of anti-Semitism at Documenta 15. A very warm welcome to you, Nicole Deitelhoff.
Ich würde ganz gern das Gespräch versuchen, ein bisschen zu strukturieren und zunächst in einem ersten
organize our conversation as follows. In the first part, we talk about the current situation, the situation now, 3 weeks after 7th October. And I would like to focus on the Middle East, that is Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Palestine, but also look at the broader context, that is the European context or the global one. And I would like to also talk about what has happened here in the last 3 weeks, what has happened in our society. And in the second part of our round, although this might be difficult, I would like to look forward. I would like to talk about the perspectives. What perspectives do we see? What might be visions or constructive ideas for the future? And I would like to ask the first question to Omri Boehm.
Vielleicht zuerst die Frage, die sich aus schiерem Herzenstakt auch gebietet, nämlich die Frage,
maybe a question which is necessary.
Ihren Freund in ihrer Familie
Anyway, what about your friends? What about your family?
ob sie Menschen verloren haben,
Have you lost
Menschen verschleppt sind.
people, or have people been kidnapped? People you know?
Our families are, the direct circle is mostly okay. Erschüttert, I think, would be the right term. Worried in ways that we haven't known for a long time, let's say. However, they are generally okay, the immediate circles of the family and friends. It is in the next circles that you start hearing some whole stories of people who have been kidnapped to Gaza. An 80-year-old man who's sitting now in Gaza, for example, so far as we know, healthy, hopefully. In other circles, also stories about people who have been massacred in some of the kibbutzim in the neighborhood. Yeah, That's the general atmosphere.
Können Sie sagen, wenn sich das überhaupt schon sagen lässt?
Could you say if it's possible at all now, 3 weeks after
In 3 Wochen
the
seit die Geiseln verschleppt sind
attacks and the
und 3 Wochen, die
kidnappings
Israel im Gazastreifen
and
Krieg führt?
the war in Gaza?
Was hat das angerichtet?
What has been the effect within or on the Israeli society? And what about the internal dynamics of Israeli policy?
It's probably too early to make very clear statements, but I would say, I mean, there is a very broad spectrum of questions that need to be asked about Israeli society, from the trauma of the Holocaust and the pogroms, and the question of the reemergence of those traumas in Israel today, the question of Israeli relation to the current extreme right government, for example. I think perhaps the most important aspect that I think needs to be thematized, even though it hasn't been, is the fact that we have entered this historical moment, and really historical crisis, in the back door of another, which is the juridical reform. I think it's extremely important to remember that we met October 7th and the massacres of October 7th while being in a de facto constitutional crisis that has also everything to do with the situation in a post-two-state era, where an extreme right government attempted to undermine the Supreme Court and the rule of law because of its interest to deepen its control of the Palestinian society. Israeli society has been for almost a year, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets marching against that reform. However, with little attention to the fact that this reform is directed against the Palestinian population in order to continue the occupation. I think that the fact that October 7th and the massacres of Hamas on October 7th took place against this background is extremely important, because within a moment, Israeli society has left those questions behind and has entered a certain state of shock in which it is now just responding to the threats that Hamas poses in Gaza. When the legal questions and the questions of what will remain of Israeli democracy when this is now all over, the fact that there are deeper questions in the background now have been forgotten, and in a way that needs to be thematized carefully, some of the worst ideas of the current government will be also accepted by the center. And I think that war is something that needs to be already now be put on the table. The reason is that there's no time to lose. We will wake up from this at some point in the day after, and we will discover that we have already lost a certain war that we had to be fighting. So I think we need to keep our eyes on this ball as well. There are many balls in the air. This is one of them.
Können Sie sagen, was Sie am meisten
Can you say what surprised you most?
Es gab ja schon viel Diskussion,
There were
aber
many
ein bisschen
discussions,
vielleicht noch eingehegte
and they were still
Diskussion
kind of contained
über die Frage der Schutzlosigkeit
to do with the vulnerability
in den Orten, an denen die Massaker verübt worden
of
sind.
those places where the massacres took
Empfunden wurde,
place.
und zwar
And this was something that was
nicht nur
felt
die Frage, wie konnte es sein,
not
dass
only
niemand das geahnt hat und
in the context of how could this really happen, that nobody could anticipate this, that the intelligence services did not respond, But what I was caught by surprise most, independent of whether you should have known that or whether there was intelligence about this or whether this could have been anticipated, was the absence of the army, and this for many hours. Can you tell me what surprised you most?
In a way, this is what made the event possible. The powers that were supposed to prevent it were not there, and the fact that they weren't, and the fact that they didn't manage to respond even half on time is shocking. It's still shocking. I think it's a real mystery how this was possible. I'm personally not surprised by the violence that we saw by Hamas. But I'm very surprised with the fact that there were little, if any, there were apparently some, but little, if any, indications that something like that was in the planning. That is very hard to imagine how this is possible. And even harder than to imagine how the Israeli security services were unable to respond in a way that would be, even within Israel already, that would provide some basic security to Israeli citizens. That is probably the greatest shock, and it's important to say, it is not just a concrete local shock, right? Because what was shocking about it does reopen those traumas, the famous traumas of Jews about the question of their security, about, at least by some standards, at least by some discourses, the State of Israel was created in order to make sure that Jews would be protected by Jews so that they would not depend on other powers. And for a long time, we have been living with a certain feeling that even if it is never completely safe and complete security is impossible, there was a certain feeling that incidents like that simply cannot happen given Israeli power, certainly in relation to the Palestinians. If one would have thought that one day a bomb would fall from Iran, that's a completely different question. The idea that an incident like that would be possible is shocking, and it goes directly to the heart, I think, of Israeli consciousness.
Ich würde ganz gerne zwei Fragen präzisieren wollen, die
I would like to make two more questions a bit more specific that arose. One was that the attack and the incredible brutality of Hamas were not surprising to you. And I think this is pretty neutrally worded. So I would like to know, why were you not surprised? I am also asking because
ich will jetzt mal sagen, in manchem akademischen
when it comes to the assessment of Hamas in some academic circles, in order to word this very carefully,
Beschreibungen gibt, die Hamas auch verharmlosen
those
oder als etwas
that are also seeing Hamas as something that it not is. And this is why I would like to ask you to make it a bit more specific. And let me first of all start with this. So why were you not surprised?
I was not surprised for two related reasons. One is more general, one is more concrete. The more general reason why I was not surprised by this sort of violence is that I think that we have, in fact, for quite some time warned, some of us, that the situation in the region is coming to a state of total war. In the territory between the Jordan River and the sea, there are 50-50, roughly 50-50% Jews, Palestinians, with a slight Palestinian majority. And for lack of a two-state solution, it has become a zero-sum game. It is going to be one people or the other. A horrifying situation. I think that in circumstances of this sort, a certain scenario of total war is becoming possible, where the dehumanization of the other group becomes an integral ideology. The dehumanization of Jews by Palestinians, the dehumanization of Palestinians by Jews, because it is necessary in order to present the situation and to fight the war as a zero-sum game in which only one of them is going to survive. In order to ensure that this is going to be you, you have to dehumanize the other people. And I think that at least as a general setting, the dehumanization of the Jews was part of the crime that we saw on October 7th. That's, as I say, the general setting. The more concrete setting is that I'm not surprised about Hamas. I'm aware of the tendency to support, tolerate, accept Hamas in some allegedly progressive circles in the left. This is something that we can talk about. I have strong opinions about that.
You can voice the...
I will, I'm not shy. I will voice them. But frankly, I think more important is what is the situation on the ground than the debates about the left elsewhere. I'm happy to get there. Hamas, the way I understand it, they're definitely not a liberation organization. They have the Hamas Charter of 1988 was explicitly anti-Semitic and genocidal. Some of my colleagues that have liked to present Hamas as a liberation organization, an anti-colonialist liberation organization, likes to say that they have abandoned their charter. I think it was in 2017, or I'm not sure when, allegedly abandoned this charter. I don't think that we need any more evidence of what we saw on October 7th in order to understand that this anti-Semitic genocidal charter was not really abandoned. And that needs to be said. I also never thought that they really abandoned it. And for that reason, I was not surprised.
Okay.
That's for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ich würde ganz gerne Nazih Musharbash
Okay, thank you. I would now like to ask Nazih Musharbash, just like Omri Boehm, I would like to ask you first, how about your friends and family? What is their situation? Have they lost families or friends throughout the past 3 weeks? So first of all, on your personal situation, please. When the attack happened, that we are condemning most strongly as the German Palestinian Society, and also I condemn personally. When this happened, I was at the Dead Sea with my family for recreation, for a holiday. And of course, a moment like this is not at all good, because you're not only surprised, you are also sad and angry. You don't want to speak about this with anyone when we learned about this, at least on this Saturday. And I realized immediately that yet again we are a step further away from a peaceful solution, and this made me sad, and until the very day I am very angry about this, and I mourn all the dead in Israel and everybody who died because of this. All of this is something that does not make sense. I have no direct family in the West Bank or in Gaza, but I have many friends with who I attended school in Bethlehem. My wife, my daughter, and myself, we actually wanted to go to Bethlehem during this time. And of course, this was something that we could no longer do. We have members of our society that come from Gaza directly, and from them I know that they've lost many family members. One has lost 2 nieces, and I wanted to also make a phone call to the other, but this was no longer possible. I could speak with him the day before yesterday, but yesterday no more. So the situation is not only sad, it is even worse. It is almost unimaginable. I don't really know how this is going to turn out in the future, and it makes me even sadder. And I agree 100% with Omri and with what he said. We need to try and see how things can become better. Just like I asked Omri Boehm about this, whether after 3 weeks you can already see or find out what the effects were on the Israeli society or politics, can you tell us what the effect was in the Palestinian society, in the West Bank, but also in Gaza? So, from your opinion, and maybe speaking about the diaspora over here later on, but first of all, let us speak about the effects of what happened on the ground. We always analyze the political situation, and we conclude that Hamas is neither representing the population in Gaza, because 60% of the population in Gaza are refugees themselves. And what they would like most is to get rid of this government. And in the West Bank, of course, because of the weakness of the Palestinian Autonomy Authority in Ramallah, and because of the corruption, there are increasing numbers of supporters of Hamas. But it is actually because of the poor political leadership. But even there, Hamas is not representing Palestinians per se. And this is why we cannot say that Hamas is representing all Palestinians and all Palestinians follow Hamas or are followers of Hamas. This would really be difficult. And if that is the discussion over here in Germany, that everybody is generally seen that way, then this is a very sad and dramatic development. Can you tell us a little bit about how you receive information at the moment about the situation in Gaza? Where do you get your information from? And what is the current situation? What do you find out? We were there for precisely 1 month. Before the attack, we were in Jordan, and we returned yesterday. That's the way it is. So the situation surprised us across the globe, but also overwhelmed us. And television stations are present everywhere, and they report about the events, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and all of them. But when I compare the images in the news there and in the news in Germany, then they are not the same. Can you describe the differences? Yes. Maybe behind this is that images are also determining politics, because we live in a media society and everybody is trying to use the images the way their audience wants to see them. So, for example, the massacre on the children in Israel was not shown in the media in the Arab world. I am saying this definitely, I did not see any. So either this is something which is deliberately concealed, or it is just ignored. I don't know. Why? I am just saying this is the way it is. How do I obtain my information? Of course, I have relatives, direct neighbors, and others. You can also talk in the street to people. Communicating is much easier than it is in Germany. And in Jordan, we have many Palestinians who live there. They account for more than 50% of the population. And there is no family of Palestinian descent that has no family members living in Gaza or in the West Bank. So you find out from those sources what their families have gone through. And can you describe what they tell you about the situation in Gaza? Well, in Gaza, they actually report about a catastrophic situation simply because of the neglect of the civilian population by Hamas, but also because of the siege of the Israeli administration. Before, the Gaza Strip had already been hermetically sealed from the air, from the coast, etc. But this has become worse. Not entirely hermetically sealed, we have to say. There are individual opportunities for medical emergencies, yes, but they have become so much constrained. I am in contact with doctors in the West Bank, and they also have their information on the Gaza Strip hospitals, and they permanently report about a catastrophic situation of hospitals that were not only shelled, but children can no longer be treated. So this is precisely a topic within the population in Jordan and also in the West Bank and above that. Just because there is somebody who's coughing, would you like to have a glass of water? Because this is available if you'd like to have some.
Ja, eben, deswegen wollte ich ja Wasser bringen. Ich würde ganz gerne noch eine Frage nachreichen, weil Sie gesagt haben, Sie sind gerade erst angekommen.
One more question, since you said you've just arrived, and we are very happy to have you here. You told me before you went on stage about your encounters, and you told me about a cab driver. And when we talk about what has happened in those 3 weeks, everyday experiences matter too. Well, I don't want to generalize. You know, the taxi drivers in Berlin, they are quite relaxed, let's, yeah, free and relaxed. They are curious, but they talk. They tell you things. That's okay. So my wife and myself, we entered the cab and we had luggage. And he asked, "Where do you come from?" And we said, "From Jordan." And then he said, "Yeah, then you are Arabs." And then he said, "But you don't look like an Arab. Dark and dangerous is what they look." I'm not dark, I'm not dangerous, but I'm an Arab. Nevertheless, I said, so if you don't want me in your taxi, tell me and I'll get out. And then he said, no, I'm against nobody, against no religion, against no nation. I don't want to generalize, right? But right now, we are all put in one and the same box, but we need to differentiate, actually. We need to distinguish the supporters of Hamas and the majority of Palestinians in Germany want to live in peace, here and at home, in peace. And if possible, in their own country, right? Now, you're telling this with a lot of experience, I guess. You tell us about these situations. Probably you encounter these situations time and again, which would also be an explanation why you are so sovereign in your way of telling it. And yet, I would like to say, I'm sad to hear this. I'm sorry. And the association of dark and dangerous is impossible. That's racist. You don't have to say it, but I need to say so. It's racism. Well, if I may, I can also defend myself. I can protect myself. But there might be other people who feel hurt, and then you might have a dispute. Right, I think we have to call things by their names, right? You can also go and say this. There is no excuse for such a statement. Emilia, now we've heard a bit from the, so to speak, external perspective, the greater one maybe. We've heard about these 3 weeks, but actually we could open the whole picture much more. But we've talked about the very situation and what has happened in the last 3 weeks in communities and societies. So I wonder, I would like to ask you, in what respect are you concerned yourself? Does it affect you immediately, and to what extent, and how? Because I guess not everybody really knows what intersectionality is and why this time is also particularly challenging and maybe difficult for people who think and live in an intersectional way. Well, yeah. Let me tell you, in this particular situation, I'm Jewish, my father is Jewish, Ashkenazi and Sephardi from Germany and Algeria. Israel was very important in my education. My father was always a Zionist, a convinced Zionist, but at the same time I inherited the fear. In the past, my grandmother always told me, or told us, never tell anybody that you're Jewish, you always have to hide it. Nobody should know. But that's actually what we did. We had the mezuzah inside, for example, in our home, whereas my friends had the mezuzah outside, and then I thought they were wrong. Well, in a Jewish home, you have, at the outside of a Jewish home, you have a mezuzah. And normally it's at the outside. So we are in a comfortable situation because we are far away. There is a geographic distance between there and here, and of course we are emotionally concerned, and this is very emotional for me, and I'm still mourning 1,300 people who were killed and their families, and also the people who are held hostage and who are still not free. But I'm also thinking of the people who suffer from the bombings and the violence, no water, no electricity, no internet. This is a serious situation, and I'm also mourning them. So we see the sadness and the suffering of people in Israel, and we feel with them, or we think of the people in Gaza and Palestine, and then a conflict results, because we tend to think on one side or on the other. And I would like to overcome this conflict, this dilemma, because there is a feeling of sadness. It's about 8,000 people who have suffered already. Several thousands of children were killed. They are human beings, and they also have to be part of the discourse in Germany. Now, talking about intersectionality is really in this situation. Intersectionality describes the power, the constellation of power in a society, and the complexity of injustice and oppression, talking in general terms, of course. Thus, we can also analyze the situation in Israel, Palestine, under the aspect of intersectionality. And we have to look at how this debate in Germany finds its expression and is part of the power relations, and is also connected to certain positions or positionings in Germany with respect to Jewish people and Israel and Judaism. So I think a critical way of dealing with these questions is key, because there there is an untreated guilt, so to speak. So far, we have thought that in Germany they have dealt with or coped with their guilt. 6 million Jews were killed in Germany. This was a genocide, and there is no recompensation for it. Never, ever. This is impossible.
Diese Positionierung oder den Eindruck, dass
so this position, this impression, Germany
eine grenzenlose und auch
offers today with respect to a limitless, unconditional support with a state or a government is also an expression of this untreated or undealt with guilt, or feeling of guilt.
Ich würde ganz gerne den letzten Punkt, also die Frage des
the last aspect you mentioned, i.e. the question about the relationship of the German society, the German government, with respect to the state of Israel. I would like to talk about this aspect in a separate context or round here. This is certainly one of the questions we are all dealing with and have to deal with. But beforehand, I would like to ask one more question, i.e. You've told us why it's important for you to underline your own history, your family's history. Could you tell us how you experienced those last few weeks in terms of your relationship with your own history as a Jew, with a family history in which you were told to hide the fact that you are Jewish because of the fear? So this was part of your family tradition. Feeling afraid, feeling fear was part of your family tradition. So could you tell us a bit more about your particular experience in the last few weeks? Has your position strengthened or stabilized? I think my approach was a bit different with respect to hiding my identity or hiding our Jewish identity, because this is not my only identity. There are different other identities which I cannot really hide, like the color of my skin. And since my childhood, I've also had a different relationship with this particular dogma, so to speak. I obeyed, and I never told people that I'm Jewish. Right, because it cannot be seen directly. Right, you never see it, except Orthodox Jews who also wear it on the outside, but otherwise you don't see it, right? But in Germany, I realized in the last few weeks, but also a long time ago, that Jews in Germany are a projection surface for many, many aspects, which is why are being caught in a particular idea of what a good Jewish person is. And a good Jewish person has to have a good relationship with Israel, must have a reference with Israel. So this is really important, because this is being part of the German construct, also with respect to anti-Semitism. We are not free. We are not free in terms of what? We are not free in terms of the expression of our own identity as Jews. And this becomes very clear. Sorry, I lost my thought here. But
genau, und deshalb ist es dadurch, dass diese jüdische Identität eine Funktion
since the Jewish identity fulfills a certain function in Germany, because it's part of a certain construction.
Versöhnung, also eine Versöhnung
reconciliation is the buzzword here, but there was no reconciliation. There was shame, and there was also the recognition of the guilt, but otherwise we also have to see that 500,000 Rom and Romnias were killed also under the German responsibility. So the Jewish identity in Germany, because it is so very connected to Israel, is transferring the conflict to another country or to a remote area. So the true Jew is in Israel, and the true Jew is connected with Israel. That's the idea. That's what people think. Which implies that it would be very different hadn't there been a Shoah. And I think it's important to say this.
Sie wäre vorhanden und sie ist vorhanden. Es ist nur das Problem, dass jüdische Menschen, zum Beispiel, ich werde hier eingeladen und ich freue mich.
I'm being invited here. I'm happy. I would like to thank you for inviting me. But maybe what you don't know is
wenn es in einer entfernten Weise oder nicht geht, über Jüdischsein in Deutschland zu sprechen,
if it comes to discussions about being Germany, being Jewish in Germany,
unsere Stimmen nicht repräsentieren etc. Und ich finde das auch wichtig zu
you
sagen,
trigger
es gibt da auch eine Kontrolle, eine politische Kontrolle über die jüdischen Stimmen in Deutschland. Das ist
so there is also a certain control exercise on who speaks with a Jewish voice in Germany. So by inviting, you choose, you select, and this is a continuity. I do see a continuity of anti-Semitism in Germany in this context.
Also ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie hier sind.
I'm very happy to have you here.
Und es hat niemand Kontrolle darüber.
Nobody wants to control who is being invited here. And I think for me and for all of us here, it's important to have a diversity of voices and perspectives. And to also see the differences and the contours of the contradictions and to hear the differences too. And we will certainly also talk about the reference with respect to Israel in this context. Now, Nicole.
Die allerwichtigste Frage bei Ihnen ist, und zwar deswegen, weil wir kurz vor dem Ausbruch der Gewalt
just before the violence erupted in the Middle East, we talked about the question, should we be on Twitter or should we forget about Twitter? We thought we could forget Twitter as a source of information, which is what I would like to ask you. First and foremost, how did you get the information you need in the last few weeks? How did you deal with the lack of certainty or reliability of the sources? Well, I think the last weeks have shown that you cannot forget about X or Twitter as it was used to be called. Because you get a lot of information, but also a lot of disinformation. So being a peace and conflict researcher, I try to do what I always do when it comes to conflicts and crises. I look at as many sources as possible. We have our weekly rounds at the Institute. We have different expertises and perspectives. We are people who are experts for particular regions or arms or terrorism, and we try to get all the knowledge and all the insights together in order to analyze and assess the situation, i.e. we are consulting as many sources as possible in order to find out where we are. And of course, we also use the social media, and we also double-check with other sources, right? But I think, and that's an experience many have made, I guess it's extremely difficult to really get a lot of clear information in a conflict. I mean, this is not the first one, and it's difficult to get a source which is quicker than the social media in order to get the information. But then it's extremely difficult to verify the information you get. It takes long. And yet people tend to judge on the basis of this quick information they get, this first-hand information on the social media channels. Now, since the three other panelists also spoke about their history a bit, and I said for myself, 7th October is the date. However, we can also discuss whether this is the right moment. So maybe in a broader context, has the international community ignored the Middle East conflict too long and in a negligent way? And what about the statelessness of the Palestinians and the lack of political perspective? Was it part of the puzzle right away? Well, not always, I'd say. And I think you always have to be very clear that this conflict has not begun on 7th October, and it was not the first or the second intifada either. It goes back a long, long time. It stems from the time when it was possible to establish a state of Israel in the former British mandate zone of Palestine. And then you know the UN partition plan, i.e. the partition of the territory, one part for a state of Israel and one part for Palestine. And later Israeli governments agreed. Arab nations did not agree, and only a few hours after the state of Israel was declared, the Arab side took to the arms and tried to go back to the situation beforehand. And we know what happened in the decades to come, lots of wars and conflicts with neighboring states who always refused to accept the right of existence of Israel. Only later there is a partial recognition of the right of existence of Israel by Egypt and later also by Jordan, but it's still not accepted in the region as a whole. And this is what you have to bear in mind. Now, the conflict was the zero-sum game that has been mentioned here in the beginning. This was about two units or populations that saw themselves as nations, and they claimed the same territory with the logic, if I don't get it, the other side will have it, which has characterized the conflict from day one. And then in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, the Oslo Friedens peace process started. There were secret negotiations in Oslo between the PLO and representatives of the Israeli government, not the top layers, and then eventually the decisive breakthrough. Israel recognizes or accepts the PLO as the representation of the Palestinians, and the PLO recognizes the right of existence of the State of Israel and declares that it will refrain from using the arms in order to fight for their rights, which leads to the idea of the two-state solution. And this was the first time they tried to overcome the zero-sum game situation. The whole thing failed, but it was not always between the two, right? It was not the conflict between the two negotiating parties. The beginning of the peace plan of Oslo, there were problems within both groups, extremist Palestinians and extremist Israelis in the respective delegations. The Hamas also included in the Palestinian side in suicide bombings resulting, and then eventually a standstill also in the negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. The two-state solution has almost disappeared in the last few years. We have a one-state reality. We have a right-wing government in Israel, more leaning to the right than any other government before, with a very harsh stance in the occupation policy. And the protests last year showed that there were attempts to do something about it, and this is a major problem. So we were once again in the zero-sum situation. And this is not only due to the right-wing government in Israel, because at the same time, on the Palestinian side, we see similar conflicts. Let me interrupt you and ask another question.
So what I intended with my question is, what does the international community take as a stance? And my question was this conflict negligently ignored? Did they just assume that it's kind of something that you can now leave up to them, or, you know, there were initiatives every here and then, but the statelessness of Palestinians, was this the price to be paid? Or you could also word this differently. You could also say, is the security of the State of Israel something that was only conceived in one way, in a way that would not guarantee security? So to have it, you know, smolder or linger, and maybe this was something that was not only questionable from the Palestinian perspective, but also when it came to Jewish Israelis and their vulnerability. And this is why I would like to speak about the international community's perspective. I would say that the perspective of the international community was certainly over the past years that this conflict was kind of neglected, and there were no major diplomatic initiatives in order to revive the two-state solution. But the two-state solution is certainly the one that you should actually find everywhere in all diplomatic statements, but there is nothing behind it, no diplomatic initiatives. It is mainly problematic with the Donald Trump administration in the United States, because they kind of backed Netanyahu and they just said, okay, you just do it the way you want and we will open up our embassy in Jerusalem. And with this, they made very clear that they would be willing to look away if Israel would also move further away from the two-state solution. So yes, they thought, in a way, you could ignore this, and then there was the rapprochement of the Israeli government by cooperating with the United States, with many states in the region. So then everybody said, well, the Palestinian issue does not really have to be emphasized too much, because we see that the region can also be pacified even without this. Let me just add, none of these questions that we are currently discussing can be seen as a pretext or an excuse for the violence of Hamas, at least not for me. It is therefore very important that we can analyze the situation on the one hand without legitimizing anything. I think this is something that goes without saying, but I wanted to say that nonetheless. Yes, Nazim. There is no legitimization whatsoever for the Hamas activities, but the background and the misery, and this is also what I'm holding responsible, what I'm holding the international community responsible for, that all agreements, all accords signed by the State of Israel and all states of the world, that there should be a two-state solution, that all those agreements were not implemented and were not controlled. And I am also holding Germany responsible for this. Germany and the EU and the international community. They always stood by. They looked on how Israel expanded at the cost of the Palestinians, how their settlements spread, even though Germany has only recognized the borders of Israel only within the confines of before 1967. And Germany is also speaking about a state against international law, or a situation against international law in the occupied territories. This is something that the German government has stipulated as a language to be used. And with my conversations with the German Federal Foreign Office, which I've discontinued for 2 years now, but I know from my conversations before that the civil servants working in the German Federal Foreign Office know about everything. They know about more than we do. I hope so. Yes, more than we know. They know it. When I'm telling them this and this is going on, then they say, we know. And then I say, so what is going to be the political response? But then nothing happens. A high-ranking civil servant, I spoke to him in the German Federal Foreign Office, and he wanted to find out from me, how about Israel-related anti-Semitism? And I said, I have nothing to do with this. Anti-Semitism is an issue here in Germany. And I said, just imagine the Ottomans or the Turks, just imagine they were in Palestine and they would occupy Palestine. And the Palestinians would be treated the way they are treated by the Israelis right now. Then we too would be allies. And then he said, Mr. Musharbash, this is not a way I looked at it. And then I said, well, you have to look at it that way because the Palestinians have not chosen their occupiers. And this is precisely the dilemma. So Begin and Sadat from Egypt, Rabin and Arafat, and Obama, all 5 of them received the Nobel Prize for their initiatives for peace. So what came out of them? Nothing. Where is the implementation of the agreements that were reached? And this is what I hold the international community responsible for, 100%. Because not solving the problem means that it is going to come up again and again, and violence causes counter-violence. And I'm staying in Gaza now. No justifications, but a 12-year-old child has already witnessed 5 wars. What is going to become of this child? And this is why I am appealing to the global community, to German policymakers, to try and seek justice. Because there are paths towards justice, but you have to exert some pressure on the State of Israel. And it was said, and it's being said again and again, that the two-state solution is dead. But no, the two-state solution was killed. Netanyahu always said, and you will agree with me, in 2019, in front of his own party, he said, and he said this in public, who wants to jeopardize the two-state solution has to strengthen Hamas. Just imagine this, because he didn't want to accept President Abbas from the Autonomy Authority as a negotiating counterpart. And this is why the two-state solution was neglected. So the dilemma is that we need to have a just solution, and the key to peace lies in an end to occupation. I think we will speak about perspectives later on, but there were so many persons who wanted to take the floor at the same time, so this is why I will give Omri Boehm the floor first, Emilia, Roig, and then Nicole Deitelhoff.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that we can agree about almost everything there. I'd like just to make perhaps on regarding some points, some things more specific. I wouldn't be able to hit all the targets, pun not intended. There was a question whether the international community has neglected the region. And I think that the question has to be answered with yes. And the reason why it has neglected the region is that it had assumed that Israel will be able to continue doing what it's doing and remain safe without having a political solution to the situation. The assumption was all along that the Palestinian society, mind you, the majority in the region, can be contained. And it can be contained insofar as Israeli interests are in question. And for that reason, there was this tendency, and some of us have been speaking about this for some years now, to continue speaking this silence of, we still support the two-state solution, which meant, and still means, and it's important to remember today, absolutely nothing. This is really a road to the explosions that we're seeing. Does this in any way justify or even explain what Hamas did? Absolutely not. And I must say, it seems that I think we agree about that here, tend to. It is absolutely a question that's on the table for large parts of academic circles, say in the United States, perhaps also here, and that needs to be stated and discussed. However, it is not necessarily the most important thing that's on the table. The most important thing that's on the table is at the moment the catastrophe that's now unfolding in Gaza, and there is a deep relation between the negligence of the international community in relation to the Palestinians before October 7th and the way in which it treats the situation in Gaza at the moment. Namely, when people try to speak, to talk about context, because if we speak about the context of the situation, we allegedly would justify Hamas, which we absolutely shouldn't, and I hope don't. The context helps us understand, for example, Israel's responsibilities in relation to the Palestinians, legal responsibilities. I'm a philosopher, moral responsibilities, but also, I should say, legal responsibilities in relation to the Palestinians, and they can be specified. And the responsibilities of the international community to the Palestinian population, given the Versagen of this community in relation to them. Here's one example. People now forget, but the civilian population in Gaza they're not citizens of a sovereign state. And that has everything to do with the history of occupation. Yes, colonialism. You don't need to be a post-colonial thinker in order to say that. It has everything to do with the Israeli intentions about the complete territory. I think that the statements about the quote of Benjamin Netanyahu saying that in order to kill the two-state solution, you have to make Hamas stronger, would not be controversial in Hebrew, in the pages, also outside the pages of Haaretz, to be perfectly honest. That is something that's fully explicit and a consensus in center-left circles. I don't think that this was only Netanyahu's strategy. It was also a strategy of people to the left of Netanyahu who are not interested in achieving a solution, and that needs to be said. This does not justify in the least Hamas's act. No. We can speak about that. That was made clear. I know you don't need to be told that. Some of my colleagues in New York need to be told that, and I have been telling this to them. However, it does say something about Israel's responsibility. I'll say another word about that. It is at least a question. Who is a sovereign in the region? Israel, at least by some standards, is still an occupying power in Gaza. And to that extent, it is actually responsible to protecting the civilian population. Yes. To the very least, even if this is legally not exactly the case, the fact that people in Gaza are not citizens of a sovereign state has also something to do with the history of occupation in the region. And for that reason, Israel's responsibilities to defending this population while also protecting itself against Hamas, the bar needs to be placed extremely high. This is something that is not being stated today. When Israeli officials speak very clearly about their reluctance to defend civilian population in Gaza. And for example, we are not seeing from their counterparts in Germany any statements making it clear, half enough, that Israel needs to be held accountable to international law. Rather, we hear statements against the context.
Das ist nicht wahr. Entschuldigung, aber da würde ich doch gerne einmal Einspruch einlegen, weil das stimmt nicht. Natürlich sagt die deutsche Bundesregierung, dass Israel an das Völkerrecht halten muss.
The German government says that Israel has to respect the international law. The foreign minister says so all the time. So we have to be honest. So I'm sorry, it's not true. They clearly say that Israel, in its reaction to the attacks of 7th October, has to respect the international law. You might go and say this is not meant, but officially it's said, and you have to say so. I would like to give the floor to Emilia Roig. But I would like to have a more systematic approach with respect to the questions at hand. And this means we should also talk about where are the limits to a justified self-defense and what is meant by it, and what are the concepts and the terms we use in order to describe the situation in the Gaza Strip. But Emilia, please. Well, actually, I'm worried. If you go and say this is negligence, this is not true. Because there are interests in the region. We cannot go and say there is a conflict and we look at it and then we decide whether we should intervene or not. No. There are positions. So it's not ignorance of what is happening in Gaza. It's an active protection of the violence in Gaza and in Palestine. This needs to be said. And true, in Germany it's so difficult. The debate is a very constricted one, actually. And it's not the way it should be. Are you meaning me?
Ja, ich weiß, wir machen das. Wir machen das.
We are having this debate right now, and it's important for me to say so. It was against you. No, it's not whether it's me or not, or whether it's about me or not, but I truly believe that it's important to have the spaces we have, and the spaces where we can talk about these controversies with respect, and that we truly appreciate those spaces. Well, I'm quite clear, and I know what I want to say, and it's maybe emotional.
Vielleicht auch nicht so, die ein bisschen so bedrohlich rüberkommt, ja?
You might feel like threatened or criticized, but it's important for me to make the statement. It's not an attack. It's not any assumption concerning what you think. So, please, if I may, I would like to continue.
Absolut der Fall, dass ich auch schwierige Gespräche haben musste, wirklich klarzumachen, dass die Gewalt der Hamas keine Rechtfertigung hat, keine Legitimation hat.
There is no justification.
Ich habe das Gefühl, dass es
for the violence committed by the
wichtig,
Hamas.
dass es gesagt werden muss.
And it's important
Gleichzeitig, und da sehe ich
to
eine
say,
sehr gefährliche Ambivalenz, nicht
and it
nur
has to be
sondern ein
said.
Paradox,
But then there is a
diese
paradox,
Legitimation der Gewalt
an
findet aber statt im Moment. Das
ambivalence,
heißt,
because we are seeing the escalation of violence, and the violence in Gaza is being
ich habe auch auf keinen
legitimized.
PolitikerInnen gesehen, sodass sie
And,
mit so viel Anteilnahme und so viel,
I haven't seen much empathy from
das habe ich, ehrlich
politicians
gesagt,
in
nur am Rand gesehen.
recent
Es war so eine sehr
days, and if so, in a very marginal way, only few expressed a kind of empathy.
Sehr, sehr wichtig, jetzt, wenn wir
So,
über die jetzige Situation sprechen.
We have to talk about the situation today.
Also nochmal, wir haben eine sehr bequeme geografische
And as I said, we are in a comfortable position because we are far away.
Ein bisschen als Bedingung habe ich das Gefühl, und jetzt nicht hier in diesem Raum, sondern generell in Deutschland als Bedingung für die Beendung der Gewalt in Gaza. Und für mich ist es gibt
This is apparently also part of the condition for the ending of the violence in Gaza, but there is no justification. And this is no justification for the violence which is happening in Gaza.
Es gibt die Frage des Antisemitismus, weil,
And then
genau, Sie haben
the
gesagt,
question of
ja,
antisemitism.
gibt es in Deutschland.
As you said
Ja,
correctly,
tatsächlich
there
gibt es
is
Antisemitismus
antisemitism in Germany.
Und,
Indeed, there is.
Das, was mich sehr stört, ist die Art und Weise, wie plötzlich
But
haben das Gefühl,
I'm
dass
bothered by
Antisemitismus auf
the
einmal
way
aufgetaucht ist in Deutschland. Und die Empörung, die
people
es geben sollte,
talk
also
about
Antisemitismus ist real
antisemitism.
in
I mean,
Deutschland.
it's real in Germany.
Zutiefst antisemitische Partei.
It's
die
a deeply
jetzt
anti-Semitic
so viel Macht,
party,
gewinnt.
which is all of a sudden
Haben wir jetzt
gaining a lot of
gleiche
power.
Empörung mit so viel Eifrigkeit und mit so viel Ehrgeiz gesehen und so viel Herzblut
And now
gesehen,
we see a lot of
wie dieser
passion
Antisemitismus auch
and
bekämpft wird.
ambition
Nein,
in
das
the
kann ich auch
debate.
sagen. Und
And
das ist nicht
have I
okay, weil
seen
das
that
sollte auch
much
hier passieren.
passion and
Ich
ambition
will nicht verneinen,
when it
dass
comes
es
to
keinen
anti-Semitism
gibt,
in this
auch
particular
auf anderen
party?
Seiten der Gesellschaft,
So
auch
far
unter
here in Germany?
Muslimmenschen,
No.
unter anderen Menschen. Also ja, absolut, das gibt es. Es ist keine Verharmlosung.
So,
Aber
this is not about
zweierlei
declaring that
mit
this kind of violence, the violence we do see in the Middle East right now, is harmless, but there are apparently two ways of looking at the situation and two ways, two standards, so to speak, in order to measure.
Dann haben wir gesehen, dass Deutschland ihr
Because
Antisemitismusproblem
if
gar nicht
there is anti-Semitism against people who are black or not white, Germany has not solved its problem with anti-Semitism at all.
Vielleicht noch gerne ergänzen, nicht widersprechen wollen.
I don't want to contradict, I want to add
Ich wünschte mir,
and say
ich wäre zu dieser Form von intellektueller Distanz
that
in der Lage.
I would love to be intellectually
Ich muss auch sagen,
distant,
es ist mir auch nicht gegeben,
or that I'd be capable of
jüdische Deutsche,
this particular
die sich
intellectual distance, but this is not given to me as a non-Jewish German who feels obliged
und
because of the Shoah.
bindet einen dann leider nicht
And
all
this
den komplizierten Fragen, die dann immer
does
noch
not
zusammenhängen.
help you solve all these complex questions. I wanted to say so, nevertheless, and on my own behalf.
Ich würde ganz gerne ein paar der Fragen
Well, maybe
sozusagen systematisieren,
in order to systemize a
sie
bit
nochmal anders zu
the
adressieren.
broad range of questions we are dealing with in order to address them differently. For example, the question which has been part of our debate here and which has been part of the discourse in Germany and on a European level,
Der Staat Israel hat selbstverständlich
the question, what is a legitimate self-defense of Israel? I mean, of course, the state has the right to protect itself against attacks by the Hamas. But also the question, where are the limits? And are there limits to the self-defense? There is the international law or the international right, and I wonder what are these limits and what about the political debate about the definition or determination of these limits, which might also imply the military intervention, which is about the question of implementation. But maybe we should look at the normative side first and foremost. Well, I'm a peace and conflict researcher, so I'm dealing with international law once in a while. I'm not an expert in these legal questions. So Israel has the right to defend itself, to defend and protect itself against these attacks. But it has to respect the international humanitarian law or the international law in general, i.e., it must protect itself, but it should not attack the civil population or the civilian population of the other side beyond a certain extent. Of course, there are also non-military contexts we need to see, but of course we have to see that there are military strategic goals which can be pursued without endangering the civilian population. But this is we need to see also in the context of a particular region. And this is a region, and we do see Gaza, we do see the Hamas, and the Hamas has its command posts and missiles. And they are also using civilian sites and tunnels below civilian sites as strategic outposts. So we do have the command of a terror organization who consciously uses civilians in order to protect its own goals, which makes it quite difficult for the Israeli defense forces. So what can they do in order to fight Hamas without endangering the civilian population too much? And here we have the question of, are they allowed to do this or that? Like, should they continue the bombardments in spite of the fact that there are lots of victims, were lots of victims, and will be even more, thousands even? Oh, of course. Well, that referred to the number, right? Yes. So the dispute we have in the United Nations, in the European discourse, and also in the German discourse is about this very question. So we do have the principle of proportionality in the international humanitarian law, but it has to be applied in each and every case. So you cannot draw a line on a blackboard and say this is the truth or the situation once and for all. You have to interpret it in each and every case. Right. Now, if you look at what we have seen in those past weeks, and we saw a number of different interventions and operations, a blockade of electricity, water, and food, or this is being cut off in between after long negotiations. A limited number of trucks were allowed to enter Gaza, but according to what NGOs tell us, not enough, definitely much less than what is needed. So there is the blockade, and there is the bombardment, and individual operations of troops in the northern part, in the northern regions. Now, given that situation, we see what the military problem is in the Gaza Strip, which is densely populated. It's narrow. and densely populated. And then also the demand for an evacuation of about 1 million people who were in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and they were asked to move south, which is also one of the measures undertaken and the orders or commands given. Now, would that correspond to what you understand as a legitimate means of self-defense according to the international humanitarian law?
Ich würde sagen, und da werden wahrscheinlich jetzt einige von Ihnen überrascht aufmerken, es verbessert sich. Ich würde sagen, wenn
it's diluted, it's improving.
Was das angeht, verbessert sich.
It's improving. Some might be surprised to hear this, but it's improving. The situation is improving.
In den ersten Tagen und Wochen nach diesem Angriff,
in the first weeks, days and weeks after the attacks, Israel undertook very harsh measures, and only when there was considerable pressure from some nations declared its willingness to also open up or allow the opening up of humanitarian corridors. This did not exist in the beginning. So there was pressure and the situation is improving. That's what I mean. Also, the fact that there has not been a ground campaign so far. Many expected this to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And there might be different situations. So there is an improvement in terms of quality. With respect to the number of victims, right? But you asked me whether what we see in terms of Israeli self-defense corresponds to my understanding of the humanitarian international law, and here I say it's getting better. If you look at the first reactions, understandably, they were characterized by anger, like the complete blockade of the Gaza Strip was ordered, and then only eventually they decided to open up certain corridors for humanitarian aid. So we need to see that this is an improvement, because the international humanitarian law implies the idea of opening, of offering help to the civilian population. There should be more. We are seeing a bit more. You have to see Egypt too. Egypt did not open Rafah in the beginning. So this also matters. So we saw harsh measures. Does harsh measures mean? Well, measures which are not within the scope of the international humanitarian law. So when I go and say it's getting better, I'd say that Israel is now trying to move within the scope of the international humanitarian law. Will there be further violations of this law? Yes, absolutely. Because I don't know any military conflict where you don't have violations of the international humanitarian law. Well, I would like to ask this very same question also to the other panelists, my other guests. To what extent is there a right of self-defense? Where are the limits of an Israeli self-defense, and what has happened so far? Is it within the scope of the international humanitarian law? Well, everybody is allowed to defend him, herself. Whenever you are attacked, you are allowed to defend. An occupied people is also allowed to opt for self-defense. But the Hamas does not have this legitimation, right? But the Palestinian people under the occupation and according to the international humanitarian law has the right to defend themselves. You can read this in the documents. By whatever means, they tried with terror in the 70s, in the 1970s, kidnapping airplanes, abducting. Then they tried with other means. So They tried everything. And this wasn't acceptable either. No, I don't want to have any misunderstanding here. I'm not legitimizing. So they are allowed to defend themselves in compliance with the international humanitarian law. And what they did was not in compliance with the humanitarian international law. Otherwise, each people has the right to defend themselves. Abbas twice went and compared in a crude and wrong way. And we, the German Palestinian Society, criticized him twice, and we established a distance between Abbas and ourselves. So, as long as you fight for a peaceful solution in order to build a civilian society, you are right. And we are against any type of violence.
But we also have to tell German politicians that we accept and recognize and respect the responsibility of the German people and the German government. That they feel especially obliged to Jews and Jewry. This is our position, but not unconditionally. Following the reason of state of Chancellor Merkel, that is not unconditionally accepting the mistakes made by the Israeli government. That I criticize. And when we criticize policies by Israel, then we are named as saying something wrong. I'm criticizing policies and I'm not an anti-Semite, but, you know, there are nuances. And also, let me add, I am in favor if the European Union would stop its aid supplies entirely for Palestinians, also in the Palestinian autonomous regions. Why? Well, exclusively Israel would be responsible for the well-being of the occupied Palestinians. So this is why I am saying, all right, EU, stop your aid. Only Israel is responsible for this, and then we will see what happens. I am very reluctant to having the EU stop its aid supplies, but let me now return to Omri Boehm and after that to Emilia. So let me return to the question of the limits of what can be called legitimate self-defense, and also which words can be used to describe what is happening military-wise in Gaza at the moment?
Yeah, perhaps the beginning of an answer can go back to some disagreement that, or difference that emerged there. I didn't check too carefully, and it's possible that you did. I'm not under the impression that the German government is doing half enough in order to make it clear that Israel should be held accountable to preserving international law. The statements that have emerged, that have come out of Israel in the last weeks have been horrifying on the highest level. Yitzhak Herzog stated clearly that the distinction between involved and uninvolved civilians in Gaza is fake, is something that we have to rethink. I cannot imagine a clearer statement violating more directly international law by a higher authority in Israel. As we are now around 8,000 casualties in Gaza, with I do not remember, and I should remember, well over 1,000 children dead. I think that statements of this sort would have required condemnation in the clearest and higher levels. Nothing even near to that. Nothing even near to that has taken place. Similar statements have been made by top Israeli officials. They said that they are closing the water. They said that they do not longer, since none of us here is an expert on international law. However, we know some of it in order, for example, to say that Israel has a responsibility to minimize the damage, and in fact, in the past has made clear that, or at least alleged, that it is acting in the rounds of violence in Gaza by minimizing damage. Top Israeli officials, top military spokesmen have said, we are no longer about minimizing the damage, we are about extending the damage, not the precision. Those are statements that should have met with clear responses from the international community, and they didn't. They did not. I think that if the situation was different with another country, we would be talking about bringing back ambassadors. That's the level in which we're speaking. When 8,000 people are dead in Gaza. In any case, those are things that we can discuss, but this is not, I think, the main thing. Carolin asked me about the concepts that we should be speaking about. I want to suggest not concepts, but the standards. What would be the standards in which we are to measure what would be a proportionate action now in Gaza and what wouldn't? Israel has a right to defend itself. In fact, not the right, it has a duty to defend itself because it is a state and it has a duty to defend its citizens. It also, as I suggested earlier, has duties towards the Palestinian population, and those duties emerge out of the historical context and the legal context, which is complex. I saw the disagreements there. They are complex, but it is too easy to claim that Israel is a sovereign in the Gaza Strip. It isn't. However, the Gaza Strip is under Israeli occupation to some degree. The categories are difficult, but the territory. But it is not difficult that the Gaza Strip is not a state, right? That the Palestinians are not citizens of a sovereign state. It is not difficult to say that this fact, this is what it is, has everything to do also with Israeli responsibility in the region. What, consequently, are Israel's duty, legal and moral, towards the uninvolved civilian population in Gaza? I want to suggest a heuristic here to think about it. There are currently 224 Israeli hostages sitting in Gaza.
Man might add, also man könnte ergänzen, also es sind auch
we might add
verschleppte Geiseln mit doppelten Staatsbürgerschaften.
Some of the abductees have dual nationalities. So there are German Israelis, Argentinian Israelis, which I know.
Also nur als Ergänzung.
So just as an addition.
My suggestion is to think about the attempt to minimize the damage to uninvolved civilian population in Gaza as heuristically similar to the way that Israel would relate to the protection of those hostages. That is, if you think that there is a military target that has to be addressed and it will have so-called or not so-called collateral damage around it, I have almost no doubt that what the Israeli government will have to measure, if the standard that Israel would pose to the collateral damage, if it would be possible that those hostages would be, say, killed, the military value of targets chosen and the calculation of the collateral damage, the standards and the bars of the standards would be placed very, very high. Yeah. It seems to me quite obvious that at the moment this bar is not placed as high when Israel does not assume that it might actually bomb its own hostages in the region.
Kann ich das einmal ganz kurz kennen, nur damit wir sicher gehen, dass sozusagen das Denkmodell
to make sure
verstanden wird.
That everybody understands this concept or this way of thinking. So you suggest, in order to assess how the Israeli military is acting in Gaza, they, with all their individual steps, should at the same time consider the protection of the life of their hostages, just as they assess the protection of the lives of the Palestinian uninvolved civilians.
That Israel has some duties and legal responsibilities towards the civilian population in Gaza that arise out of the context of the occupation. And Israel has been, and to some extent still is, an occupying force in Gaza. And second, that in any case, civilian population has to be absolutely protected. And this does not mean, you will answer me in a moment, I don't doubt it. The civilian population has to be absolutely protected, which does not contradict the fact that sometimes some military targets might actually justify taking a risk and having collateral damage that includes loss of uninvolved civilian life. I suggest that when those measures are being calculated by the Israeli government and military, heuristically, we would have to think about them as those hostages.
Okay, nur einmal ganz kurz, nur dass ich mal ganz kurz sage, ich weiß nicht,
I don't really know for how long you can still be here, but you are realizing that it will definitely take a little bit longer than it would actually do, because we have not even reached the point of the perspectives moving forward. But I hope that you bear with me, that we can also address these issues calmly. And that everyone has the time to word very precisely and to also include one's own personal background. So let me just announce, I will certainly go over time, and I hope that you can bear with me so that we take this time for this discussion. I don't really know. Emilia and then Nicole, please.
Wir haben den Bereich der Selbstverteidigung längst verlassen.
We have long left this area of self-defense, and we cannot say that 8,000 civilians, amongst them several thousand children, are collateral damage. And the fact that you spoke about an improvement is really inhumane with regard to the persons living in Gaza, that you are speaking about an improvement of the situation when exactly 2 days ago violence has intensified and all communication from Gaza into Gaza was switched off. People underground can no longer report about the violence that they suffer. And I find this is highly problematic. The fact that you speak about a dilemma in this situation also shows also this kind of factual way of how you are describing the situation, which is not in line with the severity of the actual situation, where civilians are massively attacked. So you are speaking for the Israeli government to have taken harsh measures, which all sounds very cool, very fact-based, very clean, very legal. Yes, you are absolutely right. This is the way it sounds. And when you speak about the violence of Hamas, you speak about barbarian attacks, massive attacks. This is correct. I am not denying that you should not be using the words for what happened in Israel for the 1,300 civilians that were killed. But if we use this language, and if we don't use this language for what is happening in Gaza, this means that this is playing down what is happening there, and it also means double standards. Let me also continue, and after that you can certainly add. And I am always coming back to this point, this legitimization of violence. In one situation, violence is legitimized, you know, and then you speak about a dilemma, and you don't really know, it's always a case-by-case decision, and in another situation, you say, I wish it was I wish this would be the measure, the yardstick by which we are also treating human lives. So it is not acceptable to me that you are playing down or trivializing the situation in Gaza in that way. And the way in which you are handling this situation is symptomatic of the German discourse. We are two Jewish persons who are also actively voicing criticism towards the Israeli government, describing facts, and this in terms and concepts that are not even accepted in Germany. And then there is one person who is not Jewish, she is German, and with all she can in this situation, she is intervening in this situation in order to maintain a certain status quo, and this is the way, of course, you can assess the situation, but I find this is highly symptomatic. I was asked initially, how do you feel as a Jewish voice in Germany? And that is precisely what I can observe.
Ich würde ganz gerne eine Sache von mir aus klarstellen.
One thing I would like to make clear,
Ich hatte Nicole Deitelhoff
to be fair,
ausdrücklich darum gebeten,
I expressly asked Nicole Deitelhoff to explain what the normative principles are. And it was at least my understanding that the language and the wording had to do with this, so with what international law stipulates. If I may, because it is very important to make a couple of things very clear. I was not invited, I think, to speak from a personal perspective, which I don't have. You do have a personal perspective. You are not neutral. Well, let me just say something, first of all. I am not as affected as you two are. I have the luxury, and I also feel this is a luxury, to be a peace and conflict researcher without specific affiliation with the region, and to describe this from a distance. This is my role, and you might feel this is a little bit cool or factual. I deplore this, but I think you don't want to have an analysis full of emotions from me. I wasn't speaking about the situation in Gaza. When I said things are improving, this was with regard to whether humanitarian international law is respected more than before. And I think it is. In the debate, I know it is very difficult, and I also feel it is very hard that we are mixing up moral categories, moral obligations, and legal obligations that we can speak about. And those are two separate things. The same goes true for occupation. There is a legal terminology and concept to do with occupation, and in that context, Gaza is not occupied, legally speaking.
Aber Sie gehen von einem government or the UN, for example? Is this a position of the German government? At the UN, for example, it's controversial.
Nichtsdestoweniger, mir geht es darum, ist der Gazastreifen
Regardless,
durch Israel besetzt? Israel hat sich daraus
or
zurückgezogen.
to me, the question is Gaza occupied by Israel? No, Israel has withdrawn from Gaza. If you ask, is Israel still exercising control over Gaza, then I would say yes, of course, and also in a way that is not to be legitimized. But it is important for me that we are trying to use these concepts in a more precise way, because otherwise we are mixing up too many different categories. Of course, I find it's horrible to have 8,000 people who die. Every single person who dies, that's awful. But this is not what I am answering. I answer the questions and I try to analyze, according to the way I was asked. And then one more thing. The unconditional raison d'être, reason of state, that this should not lead to a situation where all mistakes of Israel are accepted by Germany. I absolutely am in agreement, and I'm not certain that anyone in the government, in the German government, would share this. And I apologize, President Biden, but also Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the German Federal Foreign Minister. I could name many different government representatives from different countries, especially Biden. He said couple of times that he expects the Israeli government to respect international humanitarian law when it is acting in the Gaza Strip. You might think it is not sufficient.
It's a friendly footnote. I would say that the statements, the way in which they did say that, I would say that the way in which they said it was too similar to the way in which my colleagues in the United States were speaking about Hamas. And no, this does not mean that Israel and Hamas are the same. There are ways of making laconic statements that are simply not enough in order to make clear that behind the words there is responsibility. Sometimes saying some laconic statements is exactly the way in order to take away the responsibility. And this is how I experience my colleagues' statements often about Hamas these days. And this is exactly how I experience the comments that I hear in this country and in the United States about Israel's commitment to international law. And I think that needs to be stated clearly because people's lives are at stake.
Ich würde ganz gerne, an einer Stelle muss ich auch sozusagen mir die Zeit nehmen.
At some point, I also need to be able to take the time
deutlicher und vielleicht auch langsamer zu erklären.
To explain something more slowly and also clearly.
Die Zusammensetzung, die mir für dieses Gespräch wichtig ist.
What I think is important as a composition for this debate, and I think it's kind of also something which is now coming into effect,
allein die Frage, ob aus unterschiedlichen Betroffenheitsperspektiven gesprochen wird,
to have representatives from different angles of being affected, but maybe from different backgrounds when it comes to experiences and perspectives, and maybe also perspectives that within themselves are way more complicated and diverse than the projections that one might have from the outside. And for me, it was also a selection of different disciplines, representatives from different disciplines and also languages. Omri, Boehm and myself, we are both philosophers. We are obliged to a specific discipline and also language. Nicole Deitelhoff is a peace and conflict researcher. And this was also about the way we speak about this conflict. For you, Emilia, I also wanted to listen to how you look at this as a political scientist, as an author, as a political activist.
Ich glaube, Sie kennen mich gut genug.
And I think you know me well enough, and you've also been invited before.
Ich habe nur eine Ergänzung.
I just wanted to add something. No, I actually think that this is a very important point to me, and we spoke about this beforehand. This was about how we can narrate, how we can speak, and what kind of genre is important for every panelist. And for Nazih Musharraf, it was also very important for me that he was a teacher. He has some experience from a very specific context that is very important for the part of the discussion that I would still like to come to, that is looking forward or looking ahead. And everybody who's here on the panel, permanently in their life and in their work, has to always deal with the nexus of particularities and universalisms. And this is to explain why and how I invited panelists, and this might also mean that things are said in different ways. And sometimes it might be irritating, or I would like to finish my sentence first, or it might also be something that is not acceptable. But, you know, it is exactly the point behind this. to try and show this, to show that it is possible to speak with one another and also engage in such controversies, and that we need to accept this, and that we can see the contours of differences and commonalities at the same time. So this is the intention. From this perspective, there is a dichotomy that I am irritated by, because it shows that your position in this case is the objective, neutral, fact-based, rational position. Let me also explain. The fact that we come or speak from different perspectives in different languages, we all speak the same language, or with an interpreter we can understand each other. But what I am irritated by is this idea or the assumption that people in Germany have this distance, that they have a certain distance and they are not part of this situation. And my point was, you are very much, or Germany is very much part of this situation. There is this emotional level, and you should not ignore it. And so far, I had the impression that I speak from this kind of emotionalized perspective, or when I speak about, or when I spoke about the language, harsh measures, etc., terror, barbarism, all of these are words that I am analyzing from a specific discourse. I'm not saying those words are wrong. I'm just saying that they are unproportionately used in order to describe different situations. So there is no neutrality. That is my point. Even if we wanted to have it, there is no neutrality. And that was my point. I wanted to make that clear.
Ich würde ganz gerne eine Frage noch in diesem Kontext.
One last question in this context about the concepts and also what is lacking at the international political level, and then let us come to the part that is kind of seeking perspectives and seeking an outlook. So the question is the question about the very long struggle at the international level for humanitarian pauses, ceasefires, corridors. So what was always hinging on each of these concepts was the question whether the right to self-defense is recognized, yes or no, and for the Palestinian side, whether they are actually recognized as human beings, as humans in need of humanitarian aid, as civilians, and whether they are perceived as such. So I would like to know from Nazih Musharbash, at the EU level and at the UN level, how did you perceive these international discussions around these issues of humanitarian pauses or ceasefires or corridors? How did you perceive this? It is almost like with any other tragedy or conflict. There are always appeals of the international community, different initiatives, that a ceasefire should be installed so that the civilian population can be spared. This is accepted by one side and not accepted by the other. We know this, and throughout this discussion, and here I need to voice my anger, people are dying. Right now, people are dying. But this violence was not stopped from neither side, and the civilian population is still suffering. even if only 20 of the at least 400 needed trucks with aid supplies on a daily basis could reach Gaza. So the civilian population is still suffering, and I am suffering with them, because the international community, again, is not capable to implement a United Nations resolution or their own decisions or the EU decisions. There are enough of them. Of the many folders, we would only need one resolution, pick one out, and if this was implemented, we would almost live in peace the day after tomorrow. But it was neglected for so long. And almost, of course, is relative. Well, of course, they are discussing all the time how to help the civilian population, and this continues, and at the same time, people are dying at both sides. And it is only just an academic discussion and nothing else. It would be kind of hands-on or practical. If internationally a step was taken, pressure would be exerted on both sides so that this would come to an end. That is my wish. Everything else is not existing at the moment. I grew up here, and I was influenced by the Peace Initiative by Willy Brandt, and this is what I wanted to implement in the Middle East. Dialogue, mutual recognition, peaceful coexistence of the partners, and creating a civil society that respects itself mutually and is not at war. So I am very sad, and of course we can discuss philosophically, academically. It is not denigrating, not at all. I come from the hands-on political realm, and I learned that when I am speaking about my own cause, I am partial. This is why I'm trying to remain objective or impartial. And if people don't like this because I explain some things, this is their own problem. I'm trying to explain, I'm trying to educate, and deplorably, this political education is kind of left behind. We don't find premises in the secondary adult education centers, and to tell them we need premises so that we can also educate people there, and it is not possible. I want us to sit together, Palestinians, Israelis, Germans, and discuss controversially, but at the end of the day, with a mutual understanding, with a feeling of mutual appreciation, and that we reach a result. I like philosophers. I know a Palestinian philosopher that you know as well. This is Sagen Husayba, one of the most important ones. And 17 years ago, he wrote a book about a utopian development. And he published his book that could not be published in Palestine because it was a provocation. He said, two-state solution will not happen. One state of the two will not be created. We don't want to have permanent occupation. Israeli civil society cannot cope with sustained occupation. So what remains is give us the basic right as Palestinians, the right to live. And this initiative is, I have to say, is kind of the basis for something that could be materialized. You have to give something to Palestinians so that they can live in peace with Israelis. And at the moment, there is everything opposed to this, and I'm so sad and angry about this.
Omri Boehm, auch noch mal die Frage nach diesem
Omri Boehm, question to you. I would almost say this very hesitant, this very sluggish about humanitarian policies, ceasefires, corridors.
It's hard for me to judge, to be honest. I'll say there's one measure that has proven extremely problematic from all directions, and that's the measure, of course, of telling more than 1 million people to just leave the northern part of the Gaza Strip and go to the south. And the reason why it has become so important is, of course, the history of the Nakba and the fact that in Israel there is currently a government that has made it very clear that it wants to go back to Gaza before October 7th, and that it supports transfers. I think that the Palestinians would be well within the reasons if they think that if they leave a certain area in the Gaza Strip, they're not going back. That needs to be said. And that's, again, part of this context that we need to understand when we're speaking about humanitarian measures. And we say, this 1,200,000 Palestinians should just go to the south while we're bombing the north. And according to international law, you'll just have to, we will recognize your right to go back there when we're done. That's, in any case, not obviously a legitimate humanitarian procedure, and under the context, it is one that is hard to imagine how it's supposed to function. That would be my comment on the humanitarian situation and the measures that are supposed to take place. You asked whether the people in Gaza are recognized as humans. I think that, again, even before October 7th, we had to admit that they were not quite recognized as humans, as those who have the right to have rights, as Arendt would put it. The notion of dispensable humans, dispensable mention, that Arendt coined, and the answer was supposed to be the right to have rights. It was not obvious that the international community looked at them in this way. 16 years of siege is a good example of the way in which the people in Gaza were treated in this way. And now we have to admit that Hamas has provided the best, not the best reason, the best cause in order to only deepen this situation. And for that reason, I'm so horrified by the question whether Israel would be held accountable to international law. I think it is the only thing that's preventing at the moment treating Gaza's people as dispensable human beings would be a strong stance of the international community on international law. Sarah Nusseibeh was suggesting the idea of Palestinians being at least recognized as having the basic rights. That did not happen. I'm not certain, one could ask him, but I can only imagine that he had the vision with a suggestion of this sort to understand that we have to recognize them as such, because otherwise, in unfolding violence in our post-two-state era, horrifying things will happen with legitimate, half-legitimate, and illegitimate claims of self-defense. And where the international community is not clear enough in protecting, how do you protect international law? You don't protect it by general statements that we expect this to go by international law. You protect international law by making clear that there would be accountability to international law and by pointing out moments in which it is broken. The German government, for example, has in the past undermined the authority of the ICC when it came to questions of its jurisdiction and its authority to make its own decisions about its jurisdiction. That is in the past. But one asks, what is now supposed to be the role of the ICC, for example, as just a threat to the Israeli military taking steps that can be persecuted? And what is the Israeli government expecting, rightly or wrongly, from the German government to do in relation to the ICC when questions will arise? And questions will arise, inevitably, in the day after. There is a difference between making general statements about Israel has to fight this under international law, that's nice, making it clear that it is accountable to international law, we're not seeing the latter, we're seeing the former.
Ich würde ganz gerne, ich würde ganz gerne für die Frage, oder sagen wir mal so, ich würde ganz gerne mit der Frage beginnen.
Let me now start with the question about perspectives.
Mit einer Frage, die für alle, die
And this
in Krisengebieten unterwegs waren oder sich mit
with the question that for everyone who is dealing with peace and conflict research or who has also traveled conflict regions, the question about an exit strategy, exit from military conflicts. Also with the discussion about the Russian attack on Ukraine, we experienced that normative questions and political questions were kind of intertwined and interconnected in an unfortunate way, and sometimes normative questions and also military and strategic and political questions, as well as tactical considerations, were kind of overlapping and sometimes also interfering with each other. So I would like to ask at this point of juncture, what is the exit strategy for the situation in Gaza, which is clearly beyond going beyond the question of what is legitimate or not? What could be different scenarios that would have to be considered in order to end violence and the humanitarian disaster, and also save lives, save those lives that can still be saved? And I would like to ask everyone about this, because I think that this is a very tricky question. Let us start with Nicole Deitelhoff. I think it is one of the most difficult questions, and the exit strategies are not really clear. This is the first thing that should be said. So if at the moment we speak about exit strategies, we actually speak about what is going to happen when Israel is successful. So if it can actually win over Hamas in the Gaza Strip militarily. The Israeli government doesn't want to occupy the Gaza Strip again. But what else? Should Gaza be left up to its own devices? Should there be an international authority? You could think about a UN mandate, maybe. So some already say restoring Israeli security after the war will take years, and yes, exactly. So that is the perspective for after. This is not the question of how to exit this violence. Okay, so exiting this violence. Again, these are two separate matters. We experienced the attack on Israel by Hamas, and the reaction of Israel, which I still believe is justified, that we need to eliminate this threat. Hamas as a threat needs to be eliminated. That is clear. The question is, how can you do this? In a way that it respects international humanitarian law, spares the civilian population. I believe this is an extreme challenge, and this cannot be neatly done. Maybe my choice of words, and I would apologize for this, is maybe shaped by conflict analysis. I don't mean to dehumanize anything. How can this be neatly done means can this be done in harmony with international humanitarian law? And if it is not in line with international humanitarian law, this means that the civilian population will massively suffer. I am aware of this, but I don't want to speak for too long, and this is why I speak in a language that you sometimes don't find so pleasant. But let me clearly state what is behind this. I am aware of this, but that is one level. So how can we eliminate the threat of Hamas? And then the question which is underlying arises, there is a root cause for what Hamas did, and there is a background. And the background is the unresolved conflict between the State of Israel and the Palestinians. And that is the question. So how can we handle this? What does what we experience right now mean for this unresolved conflict? It looks worse than even before for a peaceful resolution of this conflict, so a two-state solution. Some in the Israeli government say the two-state solution is what we need in the future, and some say, no, we need to solve the problem itself. That would be one state in which Israel has full control. You know, this is something different to, offensively take this off the table and just say we need to prevent Palestinian organizations from being in a position to do this ever again in the future. This is different from what is happening right now. And a third aspect, maybe we should think about a completely different solution. Maybe a two-state solution, two peoples living next to each other on the same territory. This might be a possibility, or we need to think about a state that in parts could be internationally administered. This is also something that we could think of. But what happens with the Israeli government after everything that we have seen? Will the Netanyahu still be in power? Will there be a center-left government after elections? All of these questions arise. Let me just add one more thing and then give others the opportunity to respond to this question. What could be an exit strategy? What can end this violence? And let me add one more aspect when it comes to the background. I simply mean to add, and I am certain that you didn't intend to say this any differently. There is also a fascist ideology behind Hamas. I think this needs to be added. The two-state solution does not only fail because of an Israeli government, it also fails because of the conflicts within Palestine and within Palestinian organizations. And Hamas is genocidal in its approaches, and we saw this on the 7th of October. Okay, this only in adding. And now the question to Nazih Musharbash. What is the exit strategy? What are the perspectives? From the experience that I have gained so far, should the situation in Gaza appease, then I believe that in 2 years from now it will start all over again. Because the underlying problem is still there. I am now not talking about Hamas and my disdain for Hamas, and now speak about the occupied territories. Because there people were living in peace and also want to live in peace with Israel. Something needs to happen there. Deplorably, the United States is now out as a mediator because they are 100% on the side of Israel, especially with the visit of Biden, etc. So the role of a mediator was somebody who was always neutral, and this is something which is not happening at the moment. What a shame. Could there be a state or a personality or an organization that you could imagine as a mediator? This could only be a UN mandate, but they will reject this because they are one-sided as well. Russia, forget it. China as well. Germany? Yeah, well, Germany. The EU, maybe yes, but then they would have to speak with one voice. Forget it. Everyone. And this will not happen either. So, I am assessing this situation according to my own perspective. The Israeli policies with the current government and the new national state law has damaged the Israelis more than the Palestinians. And so far, all further occupations were not peaceful.
Bis auf Netanyahu waren alle Vorgänger Militär und deshalb ist es
But
Gewalt
apart from Netanyahu, all the predecessors were from the military, and this is why things were conquered by the use of violence, military violence. And the Palestinians, unfortunately, have nothing, no trumps, nothing that they can use. It is spoken about them, and their role is disregarded. If something is said by the outside, it is said about the Palestinians, they are not involved. The only solution that I can find is what the Arab states in 2003 or 2004 suggested. This was an initiative in which 56 Arab and Islamic states were willing to recognize the State of Israel, to establish diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, if Israel would withdraw from the occupied territories based on the United Nations plan that was signed by Arafat and the government of Israel back then. Unfortunately, the Israeli government has not replied to this so far. This is the only possible solution that I see at the moment. All states would respect the State of Israel, and then it's not enough with the Abrahamite context and say, you know, these are 3 or 4 Gulf states that recognize the state. But this by not recognizing the Palestinian people. Emilia, please. Let me highlight once again that if Israel is successful, the intention of the Netanyahu government, and we have this black on white, is also a genocidal intention. They state we can exterminate the Gaza Strip. All of this is online, and you cannot deny this. We have this, and therefore it is very important that many experts, Holocaust and genocide experts, for example, Massaker, who is an Israeli, and he also speaks of the murder as a genocide. Clearly so. It is not only this researcher, but it was stated many times. Leading human rights organizations also speak about ethnic cleansing and genocide. But we are not qualified to decide this. It is not a matter of opinion whether you call it genocide or not. There are facts. And I don't want to be part of a discussion about whether this is a genocide or not. Because at the moment it is a relevant question. But even if it was no genocide, according to experts, though that is not the case, we still have to stop the murders of civilians, and this can only happen through a ceasefire at the moment. And we cannot really have to wait until we have thought for the future of the entire region, because we haven't found a solution for the past 75 years. We cannot continue as we do right now. So we can discuss for a long time about the long-term solution, but for the moment, we need to have a ceasefire as soon as possible. Every day that goes by leads to more casualties, more children that die. There is no justification for this. And you are kind of hiding behind a neutral, observing language, and this is why I insisted I am a political scientist as well, not because of vanity, but you know, when I'm an author or an activist, I have an opinion and you have the facts and the expertise. But you know, when you have the expertise, you also have an opinion, and then if I have an opinion, I also have an expertise. That was my point. And Sometimes we pretend, and in Germany we pretend as if the situation was not that urgent. Speaking of an abstention of Annalena Baerbock about what is currently happening in Gaza, I am horrified, and I realize that apparently there is a legitimization, a justification for the mass murder of civilians. So this is no longer credible when somebody says human lives should be respected, etc. Actually, I have lost trust, as many other people too. And this is why it would be good, and also we wanted to speak about the concepts, etc. But for me, this is not what is most relevant right now. What is relevant is that this violence needs to stop, because there is no justification for this. And we have long left the area of self-defense. Let me say this one more time. You say there is no justification. You are speaking of mass murder. You use all these terms in order to describe specific positions as facts, but they are not. 8,000 people in Gaza, were they not murdered? They were killed, yes. In every war, people are killed. Is this murder? Please speak one after the other. You know, in all wars, people die, and then you relativize, you trivialize. Because keeping to your line of argumentation, we could also say, oh, you know, this is collateral damage that 300 Israelis died. No, we don't want this. We don't want to have any justification of the death of civilians in this context. And that is precisely what you do. No, this is not what I do. For different phenomena, there are different concepts and words, and there is a reason for this, so that we can analyze clearly and cleanly. And we have to analyze first. This is unfair. I think that we have to keep those two things apart, and it's very important.
Ganz kurz, ich glaube nicht, dass es
I don't think it is irrelevant in which terms we speak. And I also think that we all agree, and we all feel this, it is not irrelevant in which language is spoken.
Now it's me. Und ich glaube, es ist auch wichtig, dass
it is also important that when we use terms like genocide or legitimate self-defense or international law, we need to look at the definitions of those concepts, and then we can criticize if we like. We can also say that the actual facts on the ground need to be collected and interpreted first in order to then say whether they are actually in line with these concepts or not. This involves a lot of work, but if we use those words, it is only fair if we can speak about whether and how they are used and how they are defined. So when Emilia speaks about quite a number of scientists and scholars who are calling this a genocide that is happening in Gaza, then I would like to add how genocide is defined, because not everybody knows. This is a crime defined by international law, which is marked by intention. Directly or indirectly has an ethnic or national or religious group and has the intention of annihilating this group, totally or partly. And there are researchers at the moment worldwide speaking about what is happening in Gaza is fulfilling the criteria of genocide. I only want to say that the part of this definition that is at least discussed controversially right now is the question of intent. So this is what is currently being argued, and there is also opposition, and not everybody is in agreement. So I think that this is the role of debates like these, that when we have terms, that we also need to use them in a precise way. Omri Boehm, I would like to ask you about this, and after that, Nazih Musharbash. In how far are we using this concept in a reasonable manner?
And judges to decide on the question of genocide, and we are not. No one here is. Oh, sorry. Maybe some people here are historians by profession. I'm not so sure. I'm not. Definitely not a judge. I think what we can say about the situation is that the G word, the genocide, needs to be used as a warning. It needs to be used as a warning about Hamas. I said earlier on in the conversation, I mentioned Hamas's genocidal character, which is significant, I think, because after what we've seen that the intentions are arguably there, and what is an articulation of an intention if not a ratified charter that indeed was maybe, this is also debatable, taken back, but we're seeing now acting in ways that seem to be adequate to a genocidal intention. The so-called mental condition, or the intention of genocide is possibly there, and we need to mention this when we speak about Israel's right to defend itself. I think we need to mention that not just for false historical traumas, the historical traumas are not false, but perhaps they're re-emergence now. The Palestinians do not have the power that the Nazis had, let's put it this way, to destroy the Jewish people. However, when Israel now has a right to defend itself, we need to notice that it is also defending itself against an organization that may have the intention and the ideology of genocide. That is important, and it is important because of that zero-sum game that's developing in the region. It is a zero-sum game because, for lack of a separation between the people, if there is no alternative to the situation, only one of them will stay. Only one of them will stay. Mm-hmm. The situation in which 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians are living on this tiny piece of land will not continue forever. We thought in the last, 2 decades that we can pretend that we will continue speaking about the two-state solution while Gaza is under siege and the Palestinians in the West Bank are being pushed out. But we're seeing that this is developing into scenarios of total violence that looks like the dehumanizing character of violence that seems characteristic of genocide. That from the Palestinian side, or Hamas's side, which we have to say are not the same. And again, this was here, in a way that's a good thing. This was not the main topic of conversation, but some of our colleagues do not understand that. Some of our colleagues actually think that defending Hamas, or to defend Palestinians, we need to defend Hamas. I'm glad that that's not a possibility here in the room. But we also need to say that given that the conditions of speaking of genocide are in the region becoming real, it is also true that certainly some elements, senior elements in the Israeli government, are speaking in genocidal terms as well. Itamar Ben-Gvir has on his party's platform, has total war against the Palestinians. Bezalel Smotrich was elected on the Unterwerfungsplan, which is an explicitly genocidal program Those are senior ministers in Israel's cabinet. And to pretend that this is not part of the question of the mental question, of the intention, of what could be the intentions, more or less clearly articulated or not, I think that we would be irrational not to say this at this point clearly, that I'm not the one to say that right now genocide is happening, and in fact, I would resist saying that, would object to saying that. But I think that we ought to shout as loud as we can that the conditions for genocidal violence from both sides are developing.
Musharbash.
Ich glaube, an der Stelle muss ich sagen, ich muss
I
das
think
loswerden.
at this point I need to really say this. It does not help the dead to discuss whether this was justified or not that they died.
Ich erinnere und zitiere den
I would like to quote again
palästinensischen Pastor, der
the
einmal
Palestinian pastor
sich gewandt hatte an die Selbstmordattentäter.
who
Der hat wörtlich gesagt,
turned
das
to the
wirkt.
suicide bombers, and he said,
Palästina braucht euch als lebendige Menschen, damit ihr den
Palestine
Staat
needs you
aufbaut
as
und nicht als
living
Tote.
beings so that you can create the state
Damit
and
hat
not
auch
as
recht.
dead people.
Darüber
And
jetzt lange
he
zu
is right
diskutieren, ob
when he says
gezielt
this.
war oder nicht. Ich möchte es mal wirklich, wie du da sagtest, den
To discuss this
Historikern
at
überlassen.
length, whether this is genocide or not, is something I would like to leave up to historians. This is not our topic right now. I have the feeling that we should mourn the dead and show our empathy, and this to both sides. This is something which
Wenn wir
is
jetzt über die Perspektive sprechen,
a problem for us all.
dann
Speaking
meine
about
ich,
the perspective,
Israel müsste
I
zum
think
Beispiel
that
das
Israel
israelische Nationalstaatsgesetz
should
revidieren,
revise
indem
its
es
in
2018
Israeli national state law.
beschlossen
In
hat,
2018, it
das
decided
Selbstbestimmungsrecht
that the right
nur
to
nur der
self-determination
jüdischen Bevölkerung
would only be given to the
zusteht,
Jewish population,
nicht aber
but
den
not
nicht-jüdischen
to
Arabern, die
the
die
non-Jewish
27%
Arabs
ausmachen.
that
Zweitens,
account for 20%.
dass das Land Israel
Secondly, the
oder der Staat Israel
state of Israel
in Eretz Israel läge,
is
bedeutet,
in Eretz
als würde
Israel.
ich sagen, in Deutschland,
As
die
if
Bundesrepublik liegt
I
im
would
deutschen
say
Land,
that
was ja viel größer
the Federal
ist.
Republic of Germany is in
Das ist
the
die Gefahr,
German
die wir
country,
als
which is much
Palästinenser
bigger.
sehen.
And this is the danger that we
Eine
see as
weitere
Palestinians.
Expansion auf Kosten der Palästinenser, und das muss bitte
Another
aufhören.
escalation or
Die
expansion
Palästinenserinnen,
at
Palästinenser
the cost
unter
of
Arafat
Palestinians,
und
and this
darüber
has to
hinaus
stop.
waren
The Palestinians under
einverstanden,
Arafat
nur noch
agreed
20% der Flächen
to have
als
only
eigenen Staat zu
20%
bekommen.
of their
Wenn
territory
man jetzt
as
die
their
Siedlungen
own
sich
state.
anguckt,
And if
dann
you
hat
look
man
at all
nur
the
noch davon
settlements, you have the
12%.
feeling that you
Und
only
das
have
geht weiter.
12%, and this
Will
is
sagen,
continuing.
die Rechte
So
der Palästinenser
I would like to say the
müssen
rights of the
beachtet werden.
Palestinians need to be
Und es muss
respected.
eine Gerechtigkeit
and
herbeigeführt werden.
Justice needs
Nur
to be
dann,
done,
aber wirklich
and
nur
only
dann.
then,
Und mit der Beendung der Besatzung
and only
hätte
with the
ich
end of
Hoffnung
an
auf einen
occupation, I would have hope for peace.
Ich würde ganz gerne Nicole Deitelhoff auch noch mal fragen.
Nicole
nach dem,
Deitelhoff,
was
I would also like to
sozusagen
ask you
konkrete Schritte sein können.
about
Wir haben
concrete
Waffenstillstand,
steps.
Waffen-
And we
Waffenpause,
spoke about the ceasefire and
ja, Hilfe für die Zivilbevölkerung. in
help
Gaza
for
schon
the civilian
angesprochen.
population in Gaza,
Es geht immer
and
auch
always
um die Rettung des Lebens der Geiseln.
we need to bear in mind that the hostages and their lives need to be saved. The situation is a nightmare for the
Ich würde
families
ganz gerne wissen, welche
of the
konkreten
abductees,
Schritte es geben
but
könnte
I would
für
also
so
like to
etwas.
know
Gibt's ja
what be the
Vorschläge aus
concrete
Spanien, auch
steps.
speziell jetzt für
There are
eine
proposals, especially
Friedenskonferenz,
from
für
Spain,
die
for a
Frage,
peace conference.
Gibt es mit welcher Vermittlerrolle auch immer
in what,
Wie könnte sowas aussehen? Wer könnten
or whoever would be the mediator, what could this look like? Who could be the participants, and what would be the preconditions so that this can happen? Or can it only happen if there were no conditions? So let me state, mediators in the conflict were never neutral. The United States were the central mediator, but they were not neutral. They were always on the side of Israel. And on the Arab state side, we had Qatar, and Qatar was always clearly on the side of Palestine, even as a mediator. So this is not always a hurdle. Mediators don't have to necessarily be neutral. And here we have mediators as well. The Qataris, but also the Turkish government are involved. And there are negotiations with Hamas when it comes to the release of their hostages. So all of this is ongoing. And this was also one of the reasons why the ground offensive was not launched, because they hoped that a solution, an exchange, a release of hostages might happen. And this is something which is currently being discussed, an exchange of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, and at the same time get the hostages released. And this, of course, would be a major step in order to get out of this violence. And I think this is what we would need from my perspective. A first step taken by Hamas, that is to release hostages in order to give Israel the room to think about other ways of dealing with this conflict. At the moment, they don't have the leeway as long as there are so many hostages that are detained and there is so little known about them. So if such a step happened, then peace conferences and peace summits could also be discussed. 1 week ago, there was already one that took place in Cairo, and then an actual new round of discussions could take place where different aspects could be discussed. Security guarantees for Israel and Palestine, maybe also what a future solution could look like, what could a future in Gaza look like, how carry on in the Gaza Strip when Hamas would have to give up its position. And then we also have the problem at the moment that on the Palestinian side, we actually don't have a legitimate representation because Fatah has also lost in support with the Palestinians, and militant organizations have a lot of support, for example, the Islamic Jihad and many other militant organizations, and so that would be a major challenge again. So based on this, we could maybe consider a ceasefire and agree on this, and it will still take a long time because regardless of the two-state solution, we have tricky problems. For example, the status of Jerusalem that both claim as a capital, the return of refugees in the territories, major issue. And then we have the question of the settlements. Last time, when we spoke about the two-state solution in the Oslo process, we had 160,000 settlers in the West Bank. At the moment, we have 700,000. And these are settlements that have long grown. Speaking about future agreements and peace solutions, we also have to speak about the fact that the mutual representations also have to be able to sell this. So they also need to generate acceptance for this in Israel and Palestine. This is a big problem when you have such a big community of settlers. How can you actually ask them to dismantle their settlements? So looking at the West Bank, what would remain? And how can you generate acceptance and ensure your own political survival? So thank you so much for your patience and also for your attention. But I really, really hope that this is worthwhile for all of us, that we are taking this time. I have one question I would like to address, because I cannot leave this without asking this question. How can we address the situation over here with us so that people don't have to be afraid when they are in the street? This has to do with anti-Semitic, but also anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, racist constellations and dynamics. From the most different friends throughout these weeks, I heard the sentence again and again, I feel alone, I feel vulnerable, and I think that many circles of friends are reducing throughout these weeks.
Es wurde jetzt hier gelegentlich so etwas über die Philosophen gespottet.
And also there was kind of some disrespect for philosophers in this context.
Ich kann auch für mich sagen, ich habe nichts anderes.
And I can only say I have nothing else. I only have this form of struggling for understanding. And I would like to know from everyone on the panel, and I would like to discuss this. Nazih, Musharbash, whoever would like to say something. So about the question of how we can guarantee that nobody feels threatened, unwelcome, or like he or she is not belonging. As was said by you before, I come from the field of education, and I believe that political education is key. Both sides need to be listened to, they need to be read, and they should be discussed. And only then, if I know both sides, I can make my judgment. Then I have heard both sides, the Israeli, the Jewish, the Arab perspective, the Palestinian perspective, and we need, in the course of these attacks, that the aggressions that need to be condemned, we need to move away from generalizing that somebody who looks like he is an Arab or maybe has the name and is already put into the box of being anti-Semitic. I think we should state everything clearly, and what I miss right now in the current context is the space where, as Palestinians here in Germany, can we mourn those who were killed in Gaza without somebody coming and saying, you're not allowed to do this. This is not allowed. Where can I make a speech and present my views on Israelis and Jews without being said or being told that, the following panelists are anti-Semitic and this is why they should not speak. And, from the adult education centers, from the churches, people are just being ignored and banned. And I believe that this is not freedom of speech the way I know it from Germany. On the contrary, the more information you have about the conflict, the better it is, so that we can have a more complete picture and judgment. Everything else is deadly for the discussion, I mean, and it would also not be very helpful. It is counterproductive what is currently happening in Germany. On the question of how we can feel safe, there is this underlying feeling of not being safe with many Jews in Germany. So this violence is actually happening, it is taking place, it's not only a feeling.
Es hat auch eben mit einem Diskurs auch in Deutschland, das konsequent auch zu
It has to do with the discourse in Germany that
das hat nicht geholfen. Ich sage nicht, dass Antisemitismus nicht
Jewish identity
ohne das, aber das hat es verschärft.
And Jews and all of this was kind of exacerbated, and I'm not saying this leads to anti-Semitism, but it is important to say that anti-Semitism is a deeply rooted social problem in Germany and needs to be solved. And AfD, one more time, this is not only racist, AfD is also a deeply anti-Semitic party. And all of this has existed before the 7th of October. And this form of discrimination and violence is something that is supported by them, and this should be taken seriously, and it's not taken seriously at the moment. There is not this huge wave of indignation, or people are not generally trying to stop AfD. I think this is something that's not happening in Germany right now. Secondly, speaking about violence, we also need to differentiate between violence in the streets, many forms of anti-Semitic violence exist. For example, people who don't want to be recognized as being Jews by their outer appearance, but also those who have a dark skin or black hair suffer extremely from police violence, and again, not only since the 7th of October. So here again, problems are minimized and they are played down, and I think there is some kind of responsibility, not also only amongst ourselves, that we recognize each other as humans, human beings. I think many people do this and try and look beyond the stereotypes, but there is also a government responsibility for this and also a media responsibility for this. And at the moment, it is not lived up to, I believe.
Yeah, I don't have solutions. Or I mean, for the Israel-Palestine situation, of course, I have easy solutions. Just establish the Haifa Republic and live in peace. But
Sie müssen erklären, was das ist, weil das nicht jeder weiß. Aber
the question about the situation, say here. I cannot make suggestions. I can make observations about the way in which the situation develops, and I think that it is very worrisome, and not in ways that we had known before. Maybe ways that we could predict might happen, but I think there is novelty in the situation. There is novelty in the polarizations that we're witnessing. On the one hand, I'll put it this way: if someone like me feels that he can, that it's not obvious that I, with my position on Palestine, can feel comfortable, a term that I usually dislike, feel comfortable speaking to, say, my colleagues in academic circles, in artistic circles. This shows that there is a serious problem. Huge circles on the left have betrayed Israelis on the left, have failed to show solidarity in monumental ways. I was happy that we actually did not address this too much here, because I think the main thing is what's happening there and not here. However, that requires statement.
Beide sind so wütend darüber, dass es
We are both so angry about this, and this is why we don't even want to start.
That requires statement. There is a real crisis. It has to be addressed. I'm not convinced that the Israeli left's response to this crisis has been convincing, at least not to me. The tendency now to go very strongly against the so-called global left and its failures, and the failures are immense. But the Israeli left needs to understand also its own failures in the last decades, and its own failures to now speak clearly about the responsibilities of our own government. However, we need to recognize that there is a huge pressure on the conversation. On the other side, the pressure is now coming from the state on Palestinians, the censorship of demonstrations, the inability to publicly express trauer on what's happening, I think needs to be named as well. And I think that it is creating, the polarization is It's very serious. I'm actually under the impression that sometimes, very often, I might be naive and I might be orbiting in very specific corners. Speaking to Palestinians has become to me the easiest thing these days. Speaking to my American colleagues in New York, very difficult from one side, and to German colleagues from the other. The Palestinians and we, at least the ones that I know, we sort of understand each other. Yeah. If only the international community would not disturb. This is nice. This is probably much too naive and optimistic as well, right? I mean, we should and also none of us here is representative of their communities, and I think that needs to be recognized.
Nicole Deitelhoff, vielleicht, aber, Entschuldigung.
No.
Have you been finished?
Please.
Okay. Also ich glaube tatsächlich, damit man sich wieder sicher fühlen kann, müssen wir auch
we can feel safe again, everybody can feel safe again. We need to work on the quality of our discussions.
Im Verlauf des russischen Angriffskrieges
in the course of the Russian war on Ukraine, there was this kind of discourse where you were either on the right or on the wrong side, morally speaking, and since the 7th of October, this has gained a new level. There is only black and white, there is nothing in between. You're either firmly on one side or firmly on the other, and trying to cope and live with ambivalence is something that we have kind of lost as a capacity, or this kind of understanding for when not every word, or this kind of forbearance in conversation is something that has been lost. And also we should not be knowing everything immediately, but maybe also questioning sometimes, and try and also distinguish between identities and positions. It doesn't really matter which identity you have for a position, but the position should count, and then we can also take it from there to discuss identities. I think this would also help us to discuss more peacefully and freely with each other.
Ich möchte nur einen Satz
One more sentence. I would like to quote Egon Bahr,
uns allen bekannt,
who we all know.
einmal vor einer
And
Schulklasse
he was standing in front of a classroom in Bonn, and he said,
mit der Moral. In der
stop
Außenpolitik
preaching
gibt es
morals.
keine Moral,
In foreign
das
policy,
ist
there is no moral.
Interessenpolitik.
There is
Darunter leiden
only
viele.
interests, and many suffer from this.
Ich würde ungern Egon Bahr widersprechen, aber
I don't want to contradict Egon Bahr,
mich erstmal
but
ganz
first of all,
herzlich
I
wirklich
would
bedanken
really
bei
like
allen,
to
dass
thank
Sie
you all.
gekommen sind.
Thank you all for coming.
Ausdrücklich allen selbstverständlich für
Expressly,
Ihre Expertise,
thank you
für Ihr
also
Wissen,
for your
für,
expertise, for your
Ihre
knowledge,
Bereitschaft, sich
for your
auch
willingness
auszusetzen.
to expose yourself to
Und
this.
danke Ihnen
And I
für,
would also like to thank you,
und übrigens auch allen, die
and also
hinter der
everyone
Bühne,
behind the scenes sitting there,
und sowohl den Stream gemacht
and
haben, als auch übersetzt
who
haben.
was
Die
responsible for the
DolmetscherInnen
streaming,
heute waren
and the interpreters
Astrid
today were
Geese
Astrid Geese and
Ich will den Namen richtig aussprechen,
I
deswegen
want
dauert
to
das jetzt eine
pronounce her name
Sekunde.
correctly, and this is why this is going to take a second.
Und Julia
And
Wardetzky.
Julia Wardetzky.
Ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you ever so much.
Und lassen Sie mich auch dies sagen.
And let me also say
Ich
this.
glaube wirklich, es gibt für
I
diese
think
Gespräche und diese
that
Auseinandersetzungen
for these
keine
discussions
Abkürzung.
and debates, there are no shortcuts.
Wir werden sie auf sehr, sehr lange Zeit
We
führen
will
müssen.
have
Wir werden,
to have them for a very long
vermutlich
time,
darin verletzt werden. Wir
and
werden
probably
vermutlich,
we will be
irritiert sein. Es wird uns
vexed,
Kraft
we will be
kosten. Wir werden
irritated, this will
Dinge hören,
cost us
die
a lot
uns
of energy,
vielleicht
we
nicht
will hear things
gefallen,
that
die
we
uns
don't like,
vielleicht nicht einleuchten,
or
aber ich würde
that
mir
we
sehr, sehr
don't
wünschen, dass wir
understand,
uns so
but
lange
I
zuhören,
wish
dass wir
that
genau
we
die
listen to
Position
each other,
der anderen
that we
verstehen, dass
really
wir
try to
genauer die
understand
Unterschiede
each
kennen,
other's
vielleicht auch
position
die Gründe
more
dafür, die
clearly,
Motive
and
dafür,
identify
vielleicht
the
sich auch
differences
andere
and also the reasons
Gemeinsamkeiten
for them.
auftun,
And
als
maybe
sie heute
commonalities
scheinen. Ich
might
würde auch
emerge,
gerne
different
sagen, dass
commonalities than what we
ich
see
glaube, dass es
today. I would also like to say that I think it needs both. The instrument of analysis is indispensable, is needed, trying to collect slowly and surely facts from what we can gather the truth. And personally, I can say I hardly know anyone who does this more scrupulously than the son of Nazih Musharbash, Yassin Musharbash. And I believe that it is precisely this combination Emilia Roig was speaking about today, most of the time, that we, need to look at the structures, we need to open up to backgrounds, to historical context, but then we need to zoom in to what this means specifically for individuals or groups. My much beloved grandmother, when she cut bread, she used to say the following sentence: sewing, not pressing. And I think this is the attitude with which we need to confront the major complexities in this world. I thank you ever so much. And the next Streitraum will take place on the 26th of November, subsumized under power, violence and resistance, and there we will speak about women and femicides, where we have different panelists, and I am happy to see you then. So thank you to everyone and enjoy the rest of the weekend.